The sleek, polished conference room buzzed with the sound of hushed conversations. Professionals in sharp suits mingled with power players of the business world, each conversation dripping with confidence and status. At the center of the room stood a group of attendees, all eager to present their ideas and dreams to the industry giants. Among them was a young black boy, no more than 14 or 15. His face was full of hope and ambition, and his eyes sparkled with excitement as he took a deep breath, ready to share his dream with anyone who would listen. He had worked hard, studied late into the night, and overcome countless obstacles in his young life. But today, at this event, he was ready to take the next step. His dream, to become a successful entrepreneur, to rise above the challenges he faced, and create something that would change the world. But as he shared his aspirations, his words were cut short by a voice filled with mockery. A woman, clearly a figure of power and privilege, in her mid-40s, stood nearby, overhearing his dream. She turned toward him, a smug expression on her face. Her gaze was cold, dismissive. "You?" she scoffed, her laugh echoing through the room. "An entrepreneur? What makes you think someone like you could ever make it?" Her voice rang with arrogance, the confidence of someone who had never faced the struggles he had. "People like you don't belong in this world," she continued, the words hanging in the air like poison. The boy's heart dropped. The words stung more than he could have imagined. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting for him to react, to feel small. But as his face flushed with hurt and humiliation, something deep within him ignited. Anger mixed with determination. He refused to let her mockery define him. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He didn't say a word, but in that moment he made a vow to himself. He would prove her wrong. This mockery, this ridicule, it would be the fuel that powered him forward. As he turned away, his mind raced with new resolve. Her laugh would be his motivation, her words the driving force that would push him to rise higher than she ever thought possible. He would make it. The years flew by in a blur of struggle and perseverance. The boy, now a young man, was no longer the uncertain teenager he once was. He had faced the harsh realities of the world, racism, bias, and the constant doubt of others who looked at him and saw nothing but his skin color. But he kept his eyes on the prize. Every time he stumbled, he picked himself up. Every time he was knocked down, he stood taller. In the quiet hours of the night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, you could find him hunched over textbooks, pushing through college applications, or working late shifts to pay for his education. It was a grind, a constant fight. But it was a fight he was willing to give everything for. Despite the voices that tried to drag him down, despite the whispered insults and blatant racism he encountered, he kept moving forward. He learned to silence the doubts of others and focus on his goals. Every time he was overlooked for a promotion, every time he was rejected by a venture capitalist, he would remember that woman's mocking laugh. The hurt she caused turned into fuel, pushing him harder to prove to the world and to her that he could achieve his dream. Meanwhile, the woman's life followed a predictable path of success. She had climbed the corporate ladder, her position only growing stronger with each passing year. She was well known in her industry, respected, even feared by some. She had everything she had ever wanted, a high-ranking job, a luxurious lifestyle, and a sense of superiority that allowed her to dismiss anyone who didn't meet her standards. She had long forgotten about the boy, the one she had so easily ridiculed years ago. To her, he was just a blip in the past, a moment of amusement. She was still living in the bubble of her privilege, surrounded by people who echoed her thoughts and opinions. She didn't realize that someone she had mocked was still out there, working, fighting, and rising. Her world continued on, untouched by the struggles of those she had belittled. But as the years passed, something began to change. The young man's hard work was starting to pay off. His businesses, once small and struggling, began to grow. He was no longer the kid who had been laughed at in that conference room. He had become a force to be reckoned with. He started getting recognition from the very circles that had once dismissed him. Investors who had once turned him away now sought him out. His name was beginning to be associated with success. The world was starting to take notice of the boy who had been underestimated. But throughout it all, one thing never left his mind: the sound of her laugh, the scorn in her voice. He didn't hold on to the pain, but he used it to fuel his ambition, to push him further than anyone could imagine. As his empire began to take shape, he knew that one day the world would see him as more than just an afterthought. And when that day came, she would realize that the kid she had mocked wasn't just a dreamer. He was someone who had turned his dream into reality. 2 decades had passed since the woman had mocked the young boy's dreams in that conference room. Time had a way of shifting the balance of power, and today, the boy who once stood humiliated in the face of her scorn was now a towering figure of success. He had become an entrepreneur, one of the most influential leaders in his field. His business empire stretched across industries, his name spoken with respect and admiration. What was once an impossible dream was now a living reality. Every challenge he had faced, every racial prejudice he had battled, had led him to this point. He wasn't just wealthy. He was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of hard work and determination. His reputation was legendary, his influence undeniable. The young man who had been pushed to the margins of society had become the architect of his own destiny, rewriting the rules that had once been stacked against him. Meanwhile, the woman who had once stood in the height of her privilege found herself descending into a very different reality. The corporate world she had so effortlessly ruled was no longer the safe haven it once had been. Her once thriving business was crumbling under the weight of unethical practices. Scandals from her past had begun to surface, and the connections she had once relied on for support were now distancing themselves. The ruthless arrogance that had carried her to the top had now become her downfall. Karma, it seemed, had finally come knocking on her door. Her wealth started to dwindle. Her high-ranking job was replaced by a public scandal that wiped away her credibility. Her life, once a picture of success, had spiraled into a struggle. For the first time in years, she found herself in financial trouble. Desperate, she turned to her old connections, those who had once admired her. But they turned their backs, unwilling to lend a hand to someone whose name was now synonymous with dishonor. And then the twist came. The man she had laughed at, the one she had dismissed as a dreamer, was now a powerful figure in his industry. He had the power to change lives, the resources to pull someone from the brink of destruction. She found herself, with no other options, reaching out to him. A call was made, an email sent. Her last hope was to ask the very man she had mocked for help. It wasn't a simple request. No, this was the moment where the tables had completely turned. The boy who had once stood humiliated now stood on the other side of the fence, looking down on her in a way she could never have imagined. She begged for a chance to redeem herself, to turn her life around. She needed a job, a lifeline, anything that could save her from the ruins she had built with her own hands. But now, she wasn't the one in control. She wasn't the one dismissing dreams. She was the one begging for a chance to survive. The woman stood at his door, a mere shadow of the confident figure she once was. The life she had built on arrogance and disdain had crumbled. The weight of her fall was evident in the way she held herself, small, desperate, and full of regret. She had come to him, the very man she had laughed at, the boy she had dismissed so easily. Her voice trembled as she asked for help. "Please, I need a job. Anything, just give me a chance," she pleaded. She could barely meet his eyes, the pride she once had now completely shattered. The irony was not lost on either of them. The woman who had once mocked his dreams was now at his mercy, hoping for a lifeline. It was a moment of bitter realization for her. The world had shifted, and the boy she had once humiliated had become a man who held the keys to her redemption. The power dynamics had completely flipped, and now she was the one asking for what she had once believed he would never deserve. He stood there, unmoving, processing everything that had led up to this moment. 20 years of struggle, of sacrifice, of overcoming every obstacle put in his way. He had climbed so high only to find himself looking down at the woman who had once held him in contempt. His mind flashed back to the days when he was that young kid, laughed at, underestimated. He remembered how her words had stung, but also how they had driven him to prove everyone wrong. That mocking laugh had become his fuel, pushing him through the darkest days. Now he had the power to change her life, to extend a hand. And yet something inside him couldn't forget the years of pain and rejection, the constant reminders of what she had done to him. But he wasn't the person he once was. He had fought too hard and too long to let anyone take advantage of his success. He reflected on how far he had come, how perseverance, resilience, and belief in himself had led him to this point. The moment was heavy with silence, and the decision weighed on him. He could help her, he could offer her a chance, but the satisfaction of seeing her beg for help wasn't lost on him. He had achieved what no one, not even her, had thought possible. But more importantly, he had become someone who was no longer defined by the limitations others placed on him. He had become the example of hope, of strength, and most importantly, of redemption. He chose not to retaliate, not to shame her further, but to rise above it all. Because at the end of the day, he had already won. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, especially not to the woman who had once laughed at his dreams. As for her, she learned a painful lesson. Karma always catches up. The world has a way of humbling those who think they can escape the consequences of their actions. And as she left his office that day, she carried with her the heavy burden of her own choices, the understanding that life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. The man walked away knowing that he had fulfilled the purpose of his journey, to rise above it all, to turn the pain into power, and to prove that nothing, no one, could ever take away the dreams that burned inside him